Sorry. No lip smacking. And that this politeness was not merely occasional and temporary, or confined to the circles of Lichfield, is ascertained by the testimony of a lady who, in a paper with which I have been favored by a daughter of his intimate friend and physician, Dr. Lawrence, thus describes Dr. Johnson some years afterwards. As the particulars of the former part of Dr. Johnson's life do not seem to be very accurately known, a lady hopes that the following information may not be unacceptable. These are all in quotes, by the way. She remembers Dr. Johnson on a visit to Dr. Taylor at Ashbourne sometime between the end of the year 37 and the middle of the year 40. She rather thinks it to have been after he and his wife were removed to London. During his stay at Ashbourne, he made frequent visits to Mr. Meynell at Bradley, where his company was much desired by the ladies of the family, who were, perhaps, in point of elegance and accomplishments, inferior to few of those with whom he was afterwards acquainted. Mr. Meynell's eldest daughter was afterwards married to Mr. Fitzherbert, father to Mr. Aline Fitzherbert, lately minister to the court of Russia. Of her, Dr. Johnson said in Dr. Lawrence's study that she had the best understanding he ever met within any human being. In Mr. Meynell's, he also comments that friendship with Mrs. Hale Boothby, sister to the present Sir Brooke Boothby, which continued till her death. The young woman to whom he used to call Molly Ashton, footnote here, Sir Thomas Ashton, Bart, who died on January 1724-25, left one son named Thomas also, and 8 daughters. Of the daughters, Catherine married Johnson's friend, the Honourable Henry Harvey. Margaret Gilbert Walmsley. Another of these ladies married the Reverend Mr. Gastrell. Mary, or Molly Aston, as she was usually called, became the wife of Captain Brodie of the Navy. Anyway, this Molly Aston was sister to Sir Thomas Aston and daughter to a baronet. She was also sister to the wife of his friend Mr. Gilbert Walmsley. Besides his intimacy with the above-mentioned persons, who were surely people of rank and education, which he was yet at Lichfield, he used to be frequently at the house of Dr. Swinton, a gentleman of a very ancient family in Staffordshire, from which, after the death of his elder brother, he inherited a good estate. He was, besides, a physician of very extensive practice, but for want of due attention to the management of his domestic concerns, left a very large family in indigence. One of his daughters, Mrs. Desmoulins, afterwards found an asylum in the house of her old friend, whose doors were always open to the unfortunate, and who well observed the project of the gospel, for he was kind to the unthankful and to the evil. In the forlorn state of his circumstances, he accepted of an offer. Oh, that's the end of that quoted part. And the fourth, this is back to Boswell speaking. In the forlorn state of his circumstances, he accepted of an offer to be employed as usher in the house of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire, to which it appears from one of his little fragments of a diary. Leicestershire? I don't know how to pronounce it. Leicestershire? I'm probably pronouncing that totally wrong. From one of his little fragments of the diary that he went on foot on the 16th of July. Quote from his diary. July 16th, Vossa fortium pedis petae. I betook myself to Bosworth on foot. But it is not true, as has been erroneously related, that he was assistant to the famous Anthony Blackwall, whose merit has been honored by the testimony of Bishop Hurd, who was his scholar, for Mr. Blackwall died on the 8th of April, 1730, more than a year before Johnson left the university. Bishop Hurd does not praise Blackwell, but the Reverend Mr. Budsworth, headmaster of the grammar school at Brestwood, who had himself been bred under Blackwell, did. The employment was very irksome to Johnson in every respect, and has complained grievously of it in his letters to his friend Mr. Hector, who was now settled as a surgeon at Birmingham. The letters are lost, but Mr. Hector recollects his writing that the poet had described the dull sameness of his existence in these words: Vitam continent una dies. One day contains the whole of my life. That's sad, huh? That it was unvaried as the note of the cuckoo, and that he did not know whether it was more disagreeable for him to teach or the boys to learn the grammar rules. His general aversion to this painful drudgery was greatly enhanced by a disagreement between him and Sir Wulstan Dixie, the patron of the school, in whose house I have been told he officiated as a kind of domestic chaplain, so far at least as to say grace at table, but was treated with what he represented as intolerable harshness. And, after suffering for a few months such complicated misery, he relinquished a situation which all his life afterwards he recollected with the strongest aversion, and even a degree of horror. It appears from the letters of Johnson to a friend, dated Lichfield, July 27, 1732, that he had left Sir Wulstan Dixie's house recently, before that letter was written. But it is probable that at this period, whatever uneasiness he may have endured, he laid the foundation of much future eminence by application to his studies. Being now again totally unoccupied, he was invited to Mr. Hector to pass some time with him at Birmingham, as his guest at the house of Mr. Warren, with whom Mr. Hector lodged and boarded. Mr. Warren was the first established bookseller in Birmingham, and was very attentive to Johnson, who he soon found could be of much service to him in his trade, by his knowledge of literature. And he even obtained the assistance of his pen in furnishing some numbers of a periodical essay printed in the newspaper of which Warren was proprietor. After very diligent inquiry, I have not been able to recover those early specimens of that particular mode of writing by which Johnson afterwards so greatly distinguished himself. He continued to live as Mr. Hector's guest for about 6 months, and then hired lodgings in another part of the town, finding himself as well situated at Birmingham as he supposed he could be anywhere, while he was no settled plan of life and very scanty means of substance. He made some valuable acquaintances there, amongst whom were Mr. Porter, a mercer, whose widow he afterwards married, and Mr. Taylor, who by his ingenuity in mechanical inventions and his success in trade acquired an immense fortune. But the comfort of being near Mr. Hector, his old schoolfellow and intimate friend, was Johnson's chief inducement to continue here. In what manner he employed his pen at this period, or whether he derived from it any pecuniary advantage, I have not been able to ascertain. He probably got a little money from Mr. Warren, and we are certain that he executed here one piece of literary labor, of which Mr. Hector had favored me with a minute account. Having mentioned that he had read at Pembroke College a voyage to Abyssinia by Lobo, a Portuguese Jesuit, and that he thought it an abridgment and translation of it from the French into English might be a useful and profitable publication, Mr. Warren and Mr. Hector joined in urging him to undertake it. He accordingly agreed, and the book not being to be found in Birmingham, he borrowed it at Pembroke College. Part of that work being very soon done, one Osborne, who was Mr. Warren's printer, was set to work with it what was ready, and Johnson engaged to supply the press with copy as it should be wanted. But his constitutional indolence soon prevailed, and the work was at a stand. Mr. Hector, who knew that the motive of humanity would be the most prevailing argument with his friend, went to Johnson and represented to him that the printer could have no other employment till this undertaking was finished, and that the poor man and his family were suffering. Johnson, upon this, exerted the powers of his mind, though his body was relaxed. He lay in bed with a book, which was a quarto, before him, and dictated while Hector wrote. Mr. Hector carried the sheets to the press and corrected almost all the proof sheets, very few of which were even seen by Johnson. In this manner, with the aid of Mr. Hector's active friendship, the book was completed and was published in 1735. With London upon the title page, though it was in reality printed in Birmingham, a device too common with provincial publishers. For this work he had from Mr. Warren only the sum of 5 guineas. This being the first prose work of Johnson, it is a curious object of inquiry how much may be traced in it to that style which marks his subsequent writings with such a peculiar excellence. With so happy an union of force, vivacity, and perspicuity. I have perused the book with this view, and have found that here, as I believe in every other translation, there is in the work itself no vestige of the translator's own style. For the language of translation being adapted to the thoughts of another person, incessantly follows their cast, and, as it were, runs into a mold that is readily prepared. Thus, for instance, taking the first sentence that occurs at the opening of the book, page 4, here we go in quotes, I lived here about a year and completed my studies in divinity, in which time some letters were received from the fathers in Ethiopia with an account that Sultan Segned, Emperor of Abyssinia, was converted to the Church of Rome, that many of his subjects had followed his example, and that there was a great want of missionaries to improve these prosperous beginnings. Everybody was very desirous of seconding the zeal of our fathers, and of sending them the assistance they requested, to which we were the most encouraged, because the emperor's letter informed our provincial that we might easily enter his dominions by the way of Denkala. But, unhappily, the secretary wrote Gayala for Denkala, which cost 2 of our fathers their lives. End of quote. Everyone acquainted with Johnson's manner will be sensible that there is nothing of it here, but that this sentence might have been composed by any other man. But in the preface the Johnsonian style begins to appear, and though its use has not yet taught his wing a permanent and equable flight, there are parts of it which exhibit his great manner of full vigor. I had once the pleasure of examining it with Mr. Emmon Burke, who confirmed me in this opinion by his superior critical sagacity, and was, I remember, much delighted with the following specimen. Quotes again. The Portuguese traveller, contrary to the general vein of his countrymen, has amused his reader with no romantic absurdity or incredible fictions. Whatever he relates, whether true or not, is at least probable, and he who tells nothing exceeding the bounds of probability has a right to demand that they should believe him who cannot contradict him. He appears, by his modest and unaffected narration, to have described things as he saw them, to have copied nature from the life, and to have consulted his senses, not his imagination. He meets with no basilisks that destroy with the eyes, his crocodiles devour their prey without tears, and his cataracts fall from the rocks without deafening the neighboring inhabitants. The reader will here find no regions cursed with irremediable barrenness, or blessed with spontaneous fecundity, no perpetual gloom or unceasing sunshine, nor are the nations here described either devoid of all sense of humanity, or consummate in all private or social virtues. Here are no Hontanats without religious polity or articulate language, no Chinese perfectly polite and completely skilled in all sciences. He will discover, what will always be discovered by a diligent and impartial inquirer, that wherever human nature is to be found, there is a mixture of vice and virtue, a contest of passion and reason, and that the Creator doth not appear partial in his distributions, but has balanced, in most countries, their particular inconveniences by particular favors. End of quote. Here we have an early example of that brilliant and energetic expression, which, upon innumerable occasions in his subsequent life, justly impressed the world with the highest admiration. Nor can anyone conversant with the writings of Johnson fail to discern his hand in the passage of the dedication to John Warren, Esquire of Pembrokeshire, though it is ascribed to Warren the bookseller. Quotes, "A generous and elevated mind is distinguished by nothing more certainly than an eminent degree of curiosity. Nor is that curiosity even more agreeable or usefully employed than in examining the laws and customs of foreign nations. I hope, therefore, the present I now presume to make will not be thought improper, the present, which, however, it is not my business as a dedicator to commend, nor as a bookseller to depreciate." End quote. It is reasonable to suppose that his having been thus accidentally led to a particular study of the history and manners of Abyssinia was the remotest occasion of his writing. Many years afterwards, his admirable philosophical tale, the principal scene of which is laid in that country. Johnson returned to Lichfield early in 1734, and in August that year he made an attempt to procure some little subsistence by his pen, for he published proposals for printing by subscription for Latin poems of politician. Agili Politianae, Pometiae Latiniae, Cubis notis cum historia Latinae poesos, e Petrarch evo ad Politianae tempora deductae, et vita Policiana fusius quam aesthetic errata addictic Sam Johnson. Which is translated as The Latin Poems of Angelus Politanus, edited by Samuel Johnson with notes, A History of Latin Poetry from Petrarch to Politian, and a fuller life of Politian that has hitherto been written. The book was to contain more than 30 sheets, the price to be 2 shillings and 6 pence at the time of subscribing, and 2 shillings and 6 pence at the delivery of a perfect book in queers. May we not trace a fanciful similarity between Politan and Johnson? Horatius, speaking of Paulus Pellinosius's Funtorius, says, "In quo natura aut olim in angelo Potiano deformitandum oris excellentis ingenii praesentante compensavit. In whom, as formerly in AP, nature compensated bodily ugliness with great intellectual eminence." Comment del Reb ab Eum Pertin, edited by Amstel, 1718, page 200. Where was I? Okay. So he was proposing to publish subscriptions of Latin poems. That's a good way to make some money, huh? It appears that his brother Nathaniel had taken up his father's trade, for it is mentioned that subscriptions are taken in by the editor, or N. Johnson, bookseller of Lichfield. Notwithstanding the merits of Johnson and the cheap price at which this book was offered, there was not subscribers enough to ensure a sufficient sale, so the work never appeared and probably never was executed. We find him again this year in Birmingham, and there is preserved the following letter from him to Mr. Edward Cave, the original compiler and editor of the Gentleman's Magazine. Miss Cave, the grand-niece of Mr. Edward Cave, has obligingly shewn me this originals of this and other letters of Dr. Johnson to him, which were first published in the Gentleman's Magazine, Volume 4, Issue 3, with notes by Mr. John Nichols, the worthy and infatigable editor of that valuable miscellany, signed N., some of which I shall occasionally transcribe in the course of this work. Oh, and we're not going to have time for that letter today. Oh, what a shame. So I'll read the letter he wrote to Mr. Cave next time. Won't that be exciting? Well, it's really a page turner, huh? Goodbye from Boswell.